Rich, first of all, it's been a long time. You may have talked about this in the INSTED doc that I helped Mendel with the timeline edit for, but just refreshing my memory, the memory of anyone who doesn't know, how did you get into? Because we're going to get to INSTED in a little bit. How did you get into this music?
Into hardcore punk rock music.
Yeah.
Yeah, uh, I when I was about 11 years old, 12 years old, my parents were getting a divorce, and my cousin, she was an older cousin, she had a boyfriend who had a van that could help us move. He was a surfer guy, and so him and a couple of his buddies agreed to help us move out of the house. And when they showed up, they were playing "Bad Religion," "How Could Hell Be Anywhere" on their cassette in the van, and they were slamming in the van, and I thought it was crazy. I'd never heard anything like it. So that was my first exposure to like hardcore punk. Like obviously, I was listening to Rodney on the Rock, and I was exposed to the Clash and things like that. But this was like a next level stuff. So that
What
was kind of
year was that?
probably 82.
And
Yeah.
at this point, are you playing bass? Like, when do you start, and how do you start playing the bass?
I started playing. I asked for a bass. I think the following year for Christmas. So by the time I was 13 or 14, I had asked to pick up an instrument and start playing. So and by that time I was really into the scene. You know, I mean, I was like buying punk records at that point and everything, and I knew, oh, I want to do this.
Well,
So
how? Oh yeah, no. Go on.
yeah, no, that was pretty much it. But that was my first exposure. I always credit Bad Religion, "How Could Hell Be Any Worse" as being one of the first. That was one of the first records I actually, when I saved up enough money to start buying records, that was the first one I went and got.
By the way, and this just hit me, and this is off the subject, but I have to say this just because I owe you a debt of gratitude because, and I think I still have it. You lent me the Clash, that documentary, and the name is escaping me.
Oh yeah, West
Um,
Way to the World.
Yes, you lent that to me and you said, "Hey, watch this. I think that you'll like it." And at that point, we were talking about doing a really in-depth instead doc, and you were like, "Just see if this gives you any ideas." So anyway, there was the opening of it, and I want to say he's singing "White Riot," I think,
Probably.
and it's just black and white, him in the studio, and I remembered watching that, and it was like wow. And then I spoke to Banks, Jeff Banks, and I was like, "Hey, Rich lent me that movie." He's all, that opening of him, like he's all, I get the chills.
It's
But
amazing.
well, how this ties back to you is last summer I edited a documentary which you can watch on my YouTube channel. That's a part of the whole Orange County Hardcore Scenester thing called Far Side Into the Studio. And the movie opens with Popeye just singing in the studio. And the whole reason it does that is because you showed me that documentary,
Oh,
and
awesome.
I never forgot that. So thank you for
Oh
that.
man, you're welcome. That's awesome. I'm happy.
Um, my
That's good.
next question for you is, how does it go from you're in the van seeing these guys slamming the Bad Religion to you going to shows?
Well, I when we as we were moving out of the neighborhood, going through the whole divorce thing, there was a couple guys down the street. They were brothers, and they were punkers, and they were on a moped, and they would drive by my brother and I. And I didn't know this at the time, but what they were doing is they were driving by my house to get to their other friend's house a few blocks away, and they had a band together. And so, but they were a few years older. They were probably 5 years older than me, and they would drive by on this moped, and they would try to like hit us, but like scare us, like as kids. And so I always thought that was cool too. These like guy with a mohawk on a moped with his brother, and they're like swerving at us, and so I made a mental note as we were moving out of the neighborhood. I wanted to meet these guys officially, right? So we moved out of the neighborhood, but my school was still right there in the neighborhood. So one day after school, I decided to walk to their house. I knew which house they lived at and this and that. And I remember walking up to their house, and they had a stencil. They'd spray painted the Vandals on the sidewalk in front of their house, and they had this car or whatever. And I ended up knocking on the door, and they were cool. They were like, "Hey, come on in," whatever. One of the guys had broken his leg on a motorcycle accident or whatever, so he was laid up on the couch right in the front room. And they invited me in, and I was like, "Yeah, here's my name." I don't remember all the details, but they basically embraced me, and that's actually it was two brothers, and one of the brothers ended up teaching me how to play bass. And they started taking me and my brother to shows because they were old enough to drive at the time. I had a few years before I could drive, and
And
so I got
what part of
exposed to.
Orange County is this that this is
This
happening?
is actually pre-Orange County. This was a tiny town called Roland Heights, which is it's technically LA County. It's right on the border, right over the hills from Fullerton. So that's kind of the geographical area. It's right over the hills from Fullerton, but in a weird suburb of LA, tiny town that no one really knows about. There was probably 10 punkers in the whole town. A side note, though, I'll tell you who knows about Roland Heights is Big Frank, because we went to the same high school.
And so when you say schools, what schools are these? Like when you were in school?
Roland High School is the high school that I graduated from, and that's also the high school that Big Frank graduated from, and that's also the high school that Paul Tollett from Golden Boys graduated from, and that's a little bit of history there and generations.
Definitely, definitely. So then you move from Roland Heights to where though? Is it Anaheim? Is it Garden Grove? Where?
Placentia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So then you moved there, and then did you keep in contact with the Mohawk guy and the guys on the moped, and that's how you continued going to shows and playing bass?
Absolutely, yeah. In fact, I picked up a job, so I was driving back over into Roland Heights to work, and then I would hang out with them and all that stuff. So I lived, when the divorce happened, I was, in middle school, and we still ended up living in Roland Heights until after I graduated. It was just further away. So I became really good friends with them, and ended up hanging out with all the punks in the neighborhood and whatever, until I graduated high school. Once I graduated high school is when I moved into Orange County, and that was Placentia. But by then I'd already had 4 or 5 years of going to punk shows with those guys, and I was driving by then and all that stuff.
And then I know you were not originally part of the original INSTED lineup when they formed. At what point do you meet those guys, and can you talk about meeting them and then ultimately getting into the band?
Sure. So back in Roland Heights, back in high school, going to shows, um, ended up starting to, the local bands, met the guys from Doggy Style and Uniform Choice. Those were the two kind of local bands that were active at the time. And through being at those shows, other guys were at those shows. I remember meeting the guys from Hard Stance, the Hayworth brothers, and and Mark and I became friends pretty quick. I was playing bass at the time. He played bass. Hard Stance was an active band. Um, it was funny. His mom had the same car as my mom, and we'd drive those cars. So he would drive up from Irvine all the way up to Roland Heights, and we'd hang out and stuff. And so we started hanging out. And we were going to rehearsals at the Stomp Box, which is and No for an Answer was forming at the time, and I'd known Casey Jones, and so he was playing drums, and I'd met Dan and Gavin at that point, and the Hard Stance guys would come out also to that some of those rehearsals, and INSTED would rehearse there occasionally, and I met Kev at shows, just high and by type stuff, and I think it just kind of gotten back to him that I had played bass, and I was at all the punk shows, so they saw that this guy's in the scene, he's part of the scene. And Kev asked me one time, I think we were at a Fenders show, I don't remember who was playing at the time, maybe Agnostic Front or something, and he had came up to me and gave me a t-shirt, an INSTED t-shirt. He's all, hey, would you want to play for INSTED? We're looking for a bass player. And I said, sure. And I was familiar with the demo tape. The demo tape was out, and they'd recorded Bonds of Friendship, and then they were making their changes. And so he goes, I'll send you a rough mix, or the recording of the album, and you can learn it. And the good news was a lot of those songs were on the demo, so I already knew them, and I just learned it. And then we went to some, it wasn't Stomp Box, I think it was called Pulsar, another local rehearsal place for bands, and rehearsed and joined. That was like right away. It was, the chemistry was really quick. You could tell.
So you did not, as I've known it, in the lore of the band and the lore of that record. So then you didn't play at all on Bonds of Friendship.
No, I did not.
Gotcha.
No, it's funny because we talked about it because the record took so long to come out. I'd been in the band for a while before the record came out, and I thought the bass tone was awful on it, and I wish I could have recorded on it, but it didn't happen. It was no big deal. The record came out. I had been in the band already, and by the time we started touring, that was the lineup.
And learning those songs, was that learning them by ear? Did you sit down with Bear, or is it just you kind of going, "Hey, I can play them"?
Yeah, by ear. It was by ear. I got lucky, you know. I was playing for a few years, but I was just like I wanted to be in the band, so I just made sure that I knew what I was doing by the time I got there. So
I've always wondered. I don't think I've ever asked anyone in the band this. How were songs written in Instead? Was it everyone contributing? Was there a couple of main guys kind of coming with riffs and stuff like that? How did that happen?
well, I think in the very early days it was the McLaughlin brothers, which was Billy and Tommy, and I think Billy wrote most of the material, and he was really into like the Style Like 13 record and 7 Seconds to Crew, and so a lot of that sound, the early what developed as the Instead sound was that, and the hard part was he was now not in the band anymore, and so that transition of the brothers getting moved out and me coming in and Bear being the main guitar guy, it we liked those same records as well, but I was listening to Minor Threat and Negative Approach and Agnostic Front. So some of the sounds started getting a little bit different. You know, it was a harder sound. Plus, New York hardcore scene was infectious because Youth of Today was happening and all that good stuff. And so a lot of people were paying attention to that style. And that style had come from records that I'd also owned as a kid, which was Antidote and Agnostic Front and Cause for Alarm and The Abused and all that. And so they were kind of replicating that stuff. So I loved it. So, you know, the sound kind of evolved a little bit.
Would you say that that's why? Because correct me if I'm wrong. After Bonds comes the 7-inch that you guys did with Big Frank on Nemesis. Would you say
Right.
that that's why the sound kind of shifted a little bit, or people talk about that? To me, I've always just heard Instead, and Instead just sounds like this Orange County hardcore band. But I just
Sure.
as I've gotten older, and you start reading zines and stuff like that, and you find old stuff, you'll read like, oh, they were trying to do this and trying to do that, and I've never seen it that way. But after hearing what you've said, that seems to be like, hey, this is kind of why it happened.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you could kind of tell, like, if you really look at a band and they're changing their main songwriters or leaving and going, you could kind of hear the records slightly change stylistically. And that's kind of what happened with us.
What was that like for you? Had you ever been in a studio before, and now you're with this band who has a 12-inch, and then you guys are recording a 7-inch? Like, you were part of something that was, what's the best way to say this? Like, you were part of something that was like happening. Like, it wasn't like, oh, we're going to record a demo. Like, you were past that.
Yeah, we were past that, and it was all brand new to me. So I was kind of the rookie of the group, I guess. You know, coming into that 7-inch, I was just like, happy to be there, and I'd not a lot of experience in the studio. Luckily, I bought a really good bass from Eric from Pillsbury Hardcore. He was a super bass guy, and he had a couple. He was really into collecting high quality instruments, and I was able to purchase a good bass, and which I played through the whole time with Instead. So I
Did
think
you
that.
know anything about what was good and what wasn't good equipment back then?
No, I didn't. I just the first time I bought a bass, it was because I wanted a black bass. So I bought that. I don't even know what brand it was. It could have been a no name brand. I have no idea. And then once I realized, I started playing after a year, and also I credit Eric too from Pillsbury Hardcore. He used to work at Toxic Shock, which is a local record store that was near Rolling Heights, and I'd go out there and buy records, and he would kind of feed me the records to buy. Like, this came out, it's really good. You got to get one. There's only two left, whatever. And so he was doing that, and then when I showed interest that I was playing music and I wanted to be in a band, he also was like, "Oh, you got to get the Fender P bass, this and that." I didn't know what the difference between any of that stuff was, and so luckily I love the Fender P bass. So um, that's what I bought from him, and it's stuck with me.